having that consulting winemaker, kind of your own in-house technical lead to say, all right, we're going to add the sulfur down at O'Neill Vintners. We're going to truck this wine up to top it off. And we're going to make sure that Top It Off knows that this truck is on its way. So making that coordination, truck gets there, Top It Off knows what to do, right? They're going to push your wine out into the tank. Maybe they're going to have a nitrogen feed going into your tanker truck while they're pumping out so that that wine stays very inert, right? This is something I might do if I'm going to be purchasing a Sauvignon Blanc, right? Sauvignon Blanc with, super aromatics that are beautiful. It's easy to just kill those in a truck ride.
Hey guys, this is Sid Patel, your host for the Wine, Whiskey and Weed Show. I have a very special guest here, Bryan Avila, and he really is going to talk about the business resilience needed for 2023 for your wine business, right? There's lots going on in the wine business, especially the climate change, new laws are popping up. So how you are adapting, how you're taking everything positively, and how you're embracing that culture in your company is what we're going to talk about. So Bryan, thanks for joining me here.
Thanks for having me on, Sid. It's a pleasure. So essentially, I think a lot of people read the Silicon Valley Bank report last year, where, essentially people are drinking better stuff, but less wine. And we've got, obviously some increased pressure on all of our producers, thanks to climate change, right? California is running out of water, except for right now. We're getting it all back in a couple of weeks. And then the East Coast has too much water, right? And too much water brings a lot more pests. So there's just so many stressors on producers these days. Obviously, when we don't have enough water, we end up with a little bit of fire. Next thing you know, we got smoke taint we got to work on. So there's just so many things. It's just keeping producers on their toes, right? And true. Them off.
Great. I want to really throw in some practical, insights here, which people can take and write some notes and apply in their businesses, right? So let's go throw some cases, like real examples on how one can handle.
A guy out in the East Coast, Matthew Finot. He's a winemaker out there in Virginia. And so Virginia's got too much rain, right? What happens when we get a lot of rain? Let's say right before we harvest, that water goes into the soil, it goes up through the roots, and it dilutes the fruit sugars and everything else in there, right? But it's diluting that potential alcohol. And so, we did essentially a trial on chaptalization, right? A process that France uses. And so, so that's an East Coast problem. They got too much water. Four Feathers Winery, lots of fires, right? Four Feathers Winery has got, essentially, they're evaluating different ways to remove smoke taint, using cross flow, using different types of techniques to pull smoke out of wine, right? You got to sell that wine. If you're sitting on a 10,000 gallon tank of Cabernet, you got to do something with it. So evaluating different processes and picking the best one at a small scale, with your winemaking team. And then once you find something that works, you write that work order, that goes out to the cellar. Now you've got a better treated tank of wine. Now, and a lot of these technologies are still developing. So those are getting better. So this is one of the reasons why we always want to make sure that we've got a good connection with the universities. The universities are doing basic research. So they're actually trying to figure out, all right, we talk about cross flow all the time, right? To remove whether it's Brett taint or smoke taint. They're the ones looking at the new polymers in these types of equipment, different types of equipment, different process, new chemistries. So we need to make sure that we're keeping that we're getting those new practices. And that's where applied research comes in, because we try this practice when we do this work at the winery level, not in academia anymore. We got to test it to make sure that it still makes our wine taste good the way we want it. And then that's going to make the cut into a practice that we actually use. If we keep using this practice, right, it eventually becomes a best practice. Another one here, we've got Dow, right? Dow Vineyards. You know, they're out in Paso Robles. They're making killer Cabernet out there. And, you know, there's a lot that goes into making that Cabernet. If you got too much sun, you're going to end up with a bunch of bleached grapes. So really kind of a multi-fold approach to how you're managing your soil, right? To keep those vines healthy. Daniel described it as, you know, if you took somebody that was out of shape versus somebody that was in great physical fitness and dropped them in a desert, which one's going to survive? The fit one. And that's his approach to the vines. So soil health, making those vines really healthy from the get-go, but then also coming in, you know, on some of those really hot days and adding that shade netting. So experimenting with the level of shade, right, is another parameter that's important. Put too much shade on, right? It's called darkness. And so finding that right percentage, that's another research trial, right? Finding how to add that to manage your soil so that it's healthy. That's another research trial. So it's these little incremental improvements, right? We're not talking about like, wow, we have this perfect drug, you inject it and everything's great after that. That doesn't work, you know. So it's these small incremental changes that you get by really working with other people. You know, one of his best advisors was reaching out to enologist, right? He's got a friend over there at enologist, and working with that group to just help bring some new ideas in. And long story short, it's really helped them out. Educator Winery, you know, they're up there in Mendocino, lots of fires, and you know, so early fires on white grapes. We started talking about, you know, one of their big concerns was, wow, how are we going to manage smoke in white grapes? Well, we find that the smoke is really going just skin deep, right? Maybe just on the outside of the skin, maybe barely in. So then now this is going to create different decisions for, well, how much maceration do we want? Do we want to crush and then press? Or do we want to just go whole cluster to press, squeeze that juice out and get those skins away right away? Well, we don't really know if it's worth that yield loss to go whole cluster to press versus crushing those grapes and then pumping it into the press, right? Is it worth it? We don't know. It's got to pencil out. Otherwise, our business turns into a hobby. So that's where applied research comes in. Also, is that you bring this research idea in. You can check now, does the wine smell different if you're using process A that you've always been using, and process B, the one that we're implementing to reduce smoke taint impact. And then we can also now take a look at the numbers. What is our yield like? Are we getting enough yield to make that loss worth it? Adrienne Uboldi, you know, she's now, I think, an operations manager over at Markham Vineyards in Napa. She's the one that reached out to the Napa RCD because they wanted to learn more about how do we save water? How do we use soil moisture probes? It's a problem. And so Dr. Miguel Garcia went out there, has been working with them. And next thing you know, they're doing a trial on one vineyard block to see if this makes sense, right? Because now you've got these soil moisture probes that you've got to drill into the ground, drop them in. You've got some wires. You might have some that are on Wi-Fi or something like that. So there's some effort. Is that effort worth it, right? So these are the types of calculations. Applied research is really where you start to say, is all this nerdy science stuff going to make me more money? Is it going to save me money? Is it going to take away my pain? And the short answer is you don't know until you try it.
What about, Bryan, you know, bulk wine shipments and color changes, or any challenges you can think about related to like logistics and bulk wine, you know, that comes to mind?
Shopping for bulk wine, right? If you've got a brand, you've got a flavor profile that you're looking for as a you know, a vintner, right? Let's say a negotiant style vintner. And what I mean by negotiation style vintner, I mean that you don't buy the grapes. You're purchasing bulk wine from other trusted vendors, maybe vendors you've never met before too, right? But you're bringing a wine into your cellar that you didn't necessarily ferment and age and do all that prep work for. So you've got kind of an unknown entity. You've got to be able to taste it, assess its health, right? Because you don't want to go out and buy a wine that's got some microbial issues that might create some other issues. So having a process for taking a wine, measuring its health, I would say by doing wine chemistry measurement, but also taking a hard look at the microbiology. I really like plating because I can see what's actually growing in there. Scorpions can work too very nicely. And those are going to give you a history of that wine and why is somebody selling you that wine? A lot of people don't necessarily go like, I just made the most amazing wine, I'm going to sell it. It is out there for sure. So, buying bulk wine is almost kind of like, thrift store shopping.
Mm-hmm.
There's some great deals out there. There's some really cool stuff, really neat wines out there, but you really don't know what you get, right? You got a desk full of these bottles on your desk with little plastic screw tops, maybe got a little tape on them. And so you start pouring those wines and they got to pass the flavor test, right? Mm-hmm. Tasting all these wines, you're writing it down, making sure that this flavor profile works for your brand. You're doing the blends. And then, once you kind of lock in on a flavor profile, a wine that you like, next it's time to figure out, okay, well, what is the health of this wine? Maybe it's a little bit sweet and it's sitting over there in refrigeration. So you get to taste it. It tastes lovely, but you have that wine shipped over. Maybe it's not stored at the right temperature. You end up with let's say a Brettanomyces bloom in the way. The wine can change. And so assessing its risk level is very important when you're buying bulk wines, right? So I want to know, if I'm a bulk wine buyer, does my wine have Brettanomyces? And if so, is it still live or active, right? It's not that I don't or won't buy a wine that has a presence of Brettanomyces, but that tells me that I have to do something as soon as this wine comes into the winery. I've got to maybe more than just take it, pump it into the tank, make sure it's gassed. I've got to make sure that I take this wine, put it into the tank, and then do a filtration order on it fairly quickly right after, right? So, assessing that wine's health beforehand is a big deal because you want that same wine that you tasted when you went bulk wine shopping, let's say it was Ciati or Turrentine or Mancuso or H&H. I want to make sure that that's the same wine in the tank that I was tasting on that day. So taking that chemical analysis from that wine you tasted, send that to the lab, and testing the wine that you get in your bulk tanker, making sure those match. That's kind of like matching fingerprints. That's a big deal, right? And so that's going to keep people out of a lot of hot water.
I think, but then there are a lot of external factors, that affect the change in bulk wine. Well, so how are the contracts handled? What happens, and how are wineries dealing with, some of the bulk wine issues that pop up as the wine arrives?
Assuming, you've got the right wines and you've done all that work up front to make sure that you've got the right stuff. At that point, then you're going to have to rely on kind of your winemaker's toolbox. There's a lot of little things that you can do to touch up a wine. And, I would say nudge that flavor in a specific direction, right?
Understood.
We're not going to want to do like an extreme Ricky Lake makeover on, a wine that you purchased, because otherwise it probably means you purchased the wrong wine, or maybe you got a really good deal, right? You're trying to make it into something it's not supposed to be. So the first thing is making sure you get a wine that's close to your wine style. And then, the next thing is you've got these tools, right? And some of these tools can be, Purple 8000.
Mm-hmm.
Adding a little bit of color. Maybe you've got some color you can add to the wine if it doesn't have enough. You've got acid additions. You can deacidify. You can add a little touch. You can do touch ups of oak. There's a lot of little things you can do to fix things. To remove color, removing color is not as easy without stripping a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So there are things like carbon, and there's things that are like nanoproteins and certain findings that you can pull out some brown characteristics. Like, for example, if you had too much oxidation, you might use PVPP or some casein that might bond up some of those brown, smaller molecules and settle those out so that you can freshen up that color. So the point is that there's no one size fits all tool for those things. If you understand, if you can see or taste the flavor that's offending, right, then it's always a good idea to confirm that by analysis. Or if you're just looking at it and it looks a little bit brown, then you might have a pretty good idea of where you need to go chemically to treat the wine, right, to get it back into the brand style that you want.
What are a good qualification, in the resume that you think is a good fit for a bulk wine buyer? For example, an independent wine merchant versus someone buying from ShopRite or Total Wine is completely different, as you know, right? They go by math, by reports, by Nielsen data, or many other things are there. They are not like an expert wine buyer. They don't have to be. They have to be a financial guy more, for example. So in that context, who makes a good bulk wine buyer?
So basically, just having all your ducks in a row, knowing what price points you can afford, being quick about the transaction, knowing, providing instruction on how you want the tanker filled, right? So having all those details worked out so that you have a very clean and fast transaction. And it's not necessarily about speed, but it's really about planning, right? The better you plan that transaction, the faster things are going to go. Like understanding what size tankers you're going to need. Are you going to need that tanker gassed, with CO2 on arrival? What kind of sulfur dioxide? So having all those instructions laid out for that facility winemaker, because that facility winemaker is not going to make your wine for you. Because there's too much liability, right? Whether you go to O'Neill or Yokeo or some other bulk wine producer, they're going to ask you what you want. And what you don't want to say is, oh, just do whatever you do or do whatever. What do you recommend? Because then you're saying, please shoulder my liability with me, right? If you give me a bad recommendation and my wine's turned out bad, I'm back to blaming you. Like, oh, you told me that I needed to add 35 parts. I probably should have added 50. My wine is oxidized. That's your fault, right? Well, those winemakers, depending on the winemaker, is going to just say, you need to tell me, right? So it makes sense for that bulk wine buyer, especially if it's a business guy, to maybe hire a consulting winemaker, right? Who can shoulder some of that liability and provide that professional opinion, because maybe what they're doing in their winery, which is maintaining sulfur dioxide at 24 to 30 or 35, works for them in a storage condition. But if we're then going to purchase that winery at, let's say you brought up O'Neill Vintners, if we're going to truck that from there to, let's say, Napa or somewhere else to bottle that wine, and it's got to go a long way, that wine's sloshing around. It might need 50 parts per million SO2. It might need 75. Make sure you know what your logistics are and get insurance, right, between there, and just have those ducks in a row so that you don't have to put that type of pressure on that winery. So getting chemistries from that winery, knowing what you want, being very clear on, the wine lots that you need, and sending the right cooperage, coordinating with the production planner so that you don't want to just have a truck show up out of the blue, because they're going to be planning, sometimes a week in advance for trucks coming in and out to to load out wine.
Super,
So
super.
communication is a big deal, yeah. And then
Mm.
also, right, you probably, or you may not have, you may be working with a custom bottling facility. So coordinating on that other end, let's say you're at Top It Off Mobile Bottling and you're gonna truck that wine from O'Neill to Top It Off. If you go to Top It Off and say, what do you recommend? They're gonna be upset too. So having that consulting winemaker, kind of your own in-house technical lead to say, all right, we're going to add the sulfur down at O'Neill Vintners. We're going to truck this wine up to Top It Off. And we're going to make sure that Top It Off knows that this truck is on its way. So making that coordination, truck gets there, Top It Off knows what to do, right? They're going to push your wine out into the tank. Maybe they're going to have a nitrogen feed going into your tanker truck while they're pumping out so that that wine stays very inert, right? This is something I might do if I'm going to be purchasing a Sauvignon Blanc, right? Sauvignon Blanc with, super aromatics that are beautiful. It's easy to just kill those in a truck ride. You can end up with that wine, if that tanker's not filled right, that wine can get, 4 or 5 ppm of dissolved oxygen. And there goes all those beautiful aromas that, you were high-fiving about when you were shopping that bulk wine and blending it with your business partners, right? And then you get to the winery and you go, gosh, this is not the same wine, it's dead. So that's, making sure that that whole process from the time you taste, going down to where you're purchasing that wine, tasting that wine is the same, pulling samples, making sure the instructions are clear, getting that wine safely in transit with insurance to the next winery, making sure that next winery is ready for you. And not only has you in their schedule to load out into a tank, but all the quality management aspects to getting there. Maybe it needs another SO2 dose. Maybe it needs some pad filtration and there's some solids. And so being there to assess that will keep that quality decline. That's the biggest thing. Once you get into bulk wine, that wine's not going to get any better on its own, right? But it can get worse.
Very good, Bryan. Anything else that comes to mind?
Here's another one with Shy Vineyards. Casey DeCesare was a winemaker, very, very creative winemaker, looking to try to figure out how to improve terroir in the vines, how to bring in more native type fermentation. This is a big winery, right? So in this case, he's using non-Saccharomyces yeast. And what is that? What is a non-Saccharomyces? Well, Saccharomyces yeast is the one that eats the sugar and makes the alcohol, right? It keeps us in the wine business versus the juice business. But the non-Saccharomyces yeast basically paves the way for the native Saccharomyces in the juice. So this was initially developed by, I think this particular product that they tried was from Lafort. But the current dogma in the wine industry is to add SO2 into this crushed grapes. You got grapes coming out of the vineyard. There's microbiology on them. You add sulfites, knocks out all the bacteria that's going to give you some vinegar, right? VA. And then we add our Saccharomyces yeast. And then next thing you know, we have a clean fermentation. The downside to some of that conventional fermentation is that you just get kind of more predictable, maybe simpler wines. And so as you start to look at more boutique wine production, start doing more native type fermentations. And the beauty about native fermentations is that you can get a lot of complexity, right? You got a lot of different organisms eating sugar and creating other flavors when it goes right? And so that's really interesting. You get more mouthfeel, you get more complexity of aromas, and just more of those nuances that people want to pay more money for. But that takes risk, right? Because the downside is that your wine can end up smelling like nail polish, which is not good. So one of the ways that they brought in this non-Saccharomyces yeast was to add the non-Saccharomyces in the very beginning, kind of let it outcompete all those bacteria that are hungry, right? Because you have this other very robust strain. It doesn't have a lot of alcohol tolerance, but it's eating some of that, the sugars. It's creating some cool nuanced aromas. And then the Saccharomyces is just kind of there building up. There's not much there. There's a very small amount of native Saccharomyces, and it takes a while to build up. If you let it do it on its own, you're rolling the dice. But with that non-sac, it really allows now the native yeast to come in and make an interesting wine without that sulfites. So that was an interesting application with the non-sac yeast. That was novel. Other interesting things, we did something with TJ Rogers with drones in the vineyard, right? So we got drones are coming in, where this particular vintner out in the Santa Cruz Mountains, he's got a very deep slope, and so essentially, what they were experimenting with was tanker drones. So instead of having this poor guy schlep this backpack full of whether it's a spray or various applications that need to be done by hand, now they're putting this into a drone, a tanker drone, so that it can be flown in a specific flight pattern up and down these vineyards to specifically spray clusters, right? Saving literally days of labor.
Interesting.
And so that technology is still being developed there. One of the biggest things that I think is, a really important aspect is soil health. I would have to say that really changing this convention from conventional farming to regenerative farming, right? Tablas Creek, right? It's been around forever, organic farmers, they make great wines, but really starting to embrace more regenerative ideas, meaning we're going to, experimenting with different ways to farm, dry farming, regular farming, and allowing more organic matter into the vineyard, tilling less, and even incorporating grazing, right? And so learning that working with nature is, maybe on the short term, it can be tough because it might disturb the balance of your vineyard a little bit. But adding regenerative farming concepts into the mix is long-term really beneficial, not only just for the planet and the environment, but for the wines. So, if you're creating, like we were talking about DAO wines earlier, really just building your soil health, taking, terroir expression to another level, and experimenting with this, right? We've had 100 years of kind of petrochem farming, and we're learning that this really isn't the way we want to go, right? It's hurting the planet, it's hurting a lot of things. And so coming back around to working with nature is something that we're a little bit unsure of, right? In the way of making sure that we're profitable. And so isolating different vineyards and really changing that paradigm, adding sheep into the vineyard, adding, less tillage, those types of things are really, people are finding as they experiment with those, that those are, they're not only they're saving money, but they're making better wines. And so I think this is going to be, this already is the wave of the future. I mean, you could just go on to LinkedIn and you can see regenerative all over the place, right? So, and this is really where you're going to really tug at the heartstrings of the Gen Zs and the millennials, meaning like, all right, this company is not only working with the land, they're making killer wines, right? This is the type of company that's going to support the way I want to live in the future. Those are important things, breaking down those individual vineyard blocks and trying new things, right? A little less tillage, a little different cover crop, bringing the biodiversity back in. That biodiversity itself is resilience, right? Maybe not in the first couple of years, right? Because it takes a while for nature to find that balance. But after, I've been told by like Greg Pennyroyal, it takes about 3 years for those changes to really start to get the effects you want to see.
Fantastic.
it's really about, you understand your business pain, you create a project around it, see if you can recruit some other members to experiment with that with you so that you can expand your learning, figure out where the best practices are, implement those best practices, just keep implementing those at a small scale and increasing the things that work, decrease the things that don't work. One of the things that I haven't really mentioned yet is we've got the Vintners Academy, which is really about training the workforce, entry-level technical people, in the cellar and in the vineyard. So the beauty about having the guild and the academy within the same organization is that as these new practices turn into best practices, these best practices are then able to be incorporated into the academy so that we can shorten the time it takes for these new ideas to come into the cellar so that the people doing the work get it and they speak that language and they don't look at you funny when you ask them to do this stuff in the cellar. And that's super important, especially when you see a lot of wineries are looking down a lot of climate change type issues. There's a lot of climate action 2030, climate action 2040, you name it, right? There's a lot of initiatives stemming from Paris Accord all the way down to state and county level mandates, right? That are going to make businesses do, and comply with that type of work. So that's like 7 years, right? That's not a lot of time. So that knowledge from innovation to, establishing a best practice to getting it into these new recruits, that's huge. Shortening that cycle is going to lead to a smarter, more engaged workforce that feels like, you guys are connected, and so that's what we're trying to do.